There was a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where something changed, and no one around you noticed because heaven rarely announces its decisions in ways the world understands. There was no applause, no validation, and no crowd gathered to witness it, yet the balance of power shifted in ways that cannot be undone. You didn't become louder, you didn't become popular, you didn't suddenly gain allies or attention. Instead, you became alone, and that loneliness was not punishment, it was positioning. Because when authority is transferred, it is never done in noise, it is done in separation. Heaven does not hand responsibility to those who need witnesses, it entrusts it to those who can stand without them. That is why people began to fade without explanation. Conversations went quiet. Invitations stopped. Familiar energy felt distant. Not because you failed, not because you offended anyone, but because your frequency changed before your environment could catch up. If you are listening to this and wondering why connections dissolved even though your heart stayed clean, understand this. Isolation is the corridor between preparation and authority. It is the narrow passage where dependence is stripped and discernment is sharpened. Crowds distort clarity. Solitude refines it. When heaven prepares someone to carry weight, it first removes the noise that would interfere with precision. That is why this season feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and deeply personal. You are being taught to move without reassurance, to trust without confirmation, and to stand without applause. This is not abandonment, it is calibration. Before we go any further, comment, "I am chosen," not for recognition, not for validation, but as a declaration that you recognize the season you are in and you are no longer resisting it. And if this message resonates, like the video and subscribe, not out of obligation, but because alignment recognizes alignment long before logic does. Now take a breath, because here is the deeper truth. Authority is never given to those who need to be seen using it. It is given to those who can carry it quietly. Heaven separates before it elevates. It removes familiar support so that your decisions are no longer influenced by approval, attachment, or fear of loss. What feels like emptiness is actually space. Space for discernment, space for clarity, and space for command. You are being trained to hear instruction without interference, to move without consensus, and to trust internal confirmation over external noise. That is why this season feels heavier than past ones. Responsibility weighs more than popularity. And while others measure success by numbers, heaven measures it by obedience and restraint. You were not isolated because you were weak. You were isolated because your next assignment requires strength that cannot be borrowed. This phase teaches you how to hold power without announcing it, how to walk forward without explaining yourself, and how to remain grounded when no one is clapping. And once this transfer is complete, you will not need to prove anything. Those who left will sense the shift. Those who doubted will feel the difference. Not because you changed outwardly, but because authority has a presence that cannot be argued with. Now that you understand this, let's dive deeper. Point 1. The loneliness was not random, it was strategic. What you're experiencing right now is not social failure, emotional rejection, or some mysterious flaw in your personality. It is strategy, divine strategy. Loneliness only feels like abandonment when you believe connection is always meant to be constant. But in higher systems of authority, access is reduced before power is transferred. Think about it carefully. Every structure that holds something valuable limits who can touch it. Banks do not sit open. Vaults are not loud. Control rooms are quiet, restricted, and isolated. your life entered that same configuration. The people who vanished were not removed to hurt you. They were removed to prevent contamination. At lower levels, connection feels like safety. At higher levels, connection becomes a risk. Too many voices distort clarity. Too many opinions weaken intuition. Too much familiarity invites entitlement. So the first move was separation. This is why it happened without explanation. No warning, no closure, because if it had been explained, you would have tried to negotiate it. And this phase does not allow negotiation. You were moved into solitude, because solitude is the only environment where identity can solidify without interference. You didn't lose people. You lost noise. And what feels like emptiness is actually space being created for authority to settle. Point 2. Silence is where authority is installed. Most people are trained to fear silence. Silence removes distraction, and distraction is where avoidance hides. When everything went quiet around you, it forced you inward. This is not accidental. Authority cannot live in someone who is constantly externally regulated. When your mood depends on messages, validation, or attention, power leaks. So the system cut off supply. Silence recalibrates the nervous system. It slows reaction time. It sharpens perception. You begin to notice patterns instead of personalities, motives instead of words, energy instead of performance. This is why conversations started to feel empty, not because others changed, but because your awareness did. Silence teaches you restraint. And restraint is power. Anyone can react. Few can remain still. And the one who remains still controls the frame. In this phase, you stopped needing to respond immediately. You stopped needing to explain yourself. You stopped needing agreement. That is not emotional withdrawal. That is internal sovereignty being formed. Silence did not weaken you. It reorganized you. Point 3. Why people could not follow you into this phase. There are people who are only equipped to know you in certain versions of yourself. And when you outgrow that version, the relationship collapses not because of conflict, not because of betrayal, but because of incompatibility at a structural level. Some people require constant access to feel relevant in your life. Some require familiarity so they can feel superior, anchored to an old image of you that no longer exists. Some require your emotional availability to feel regulated and safe. This phase removes all three at once. Access is reduced. Familiarity is gone. Emotional extraction is shut down. And that is why they could not come with you. Not everyone is designed to function in reduced access environments. Some people panic when they can no longer read you, when your inner world becomes private and self-governed. Some become hostile when they can no longer influence you, when their leverage disappears. Some quietly vanish when they realize they can no longer extract reassurance, validation, or energy from your presence. Their absence is not abandonment. It is information. It reveals what the relationship was actually built on beneath the language, beneath the history, beneath the roles you once played. This is not bitterness. This is clarity. The loneliness hurts because your attachment systems are being rewired in real time. You're learning to exist without external mirrors, without constant feedback loops telling you who you are allowed to be. You're becoming internally referenced. And that solitude is not a punishment. It is the final requirement before authority, discernment, and self-trust are placed fully in your hands. Point 4. The invisible transfer of power. Power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, unnoticed by those who rely on spectacle, noise, and reaction to feel secure. The moment you stopped chasing clarity from people who benefited from your confusion, power shifted. The moment you stopped proving your intentions to those who had already decided to misunderstand you, power settled. The moment you accepted being misread without correcting the narrative, authority locked in. Because the one who does not seek permission cannot be controlled, and the one who cannot be controlled becomes unpredictable to systems that depend on leverage. This is where people started to feel you differently. Not because you raised your voice, asserted dominance, or demanded respect, but because you removed yourself from the emotional economy they were used to exploiting. You became unresponsive to manipulation. You stopped feeding explanations into environments that thrived on distortion. Emotional neutrality is deeply threatening to systems built on reaction, guilt, fear, and obligation. When someone cannot provoke you, they cannot steer you. When someone cannot read you, they cannot plan against you. You didn't confront them, and that confused them. You didn't collapse, and that unsettled them. You withdrew, and they mistook it for weakness until the consequences arrived. Withdrawal is not retreat. It is repositioning. It is choosing higher ground without announcing the move. It is stepping out of reach while others are still swinging. In silence, you recalibrated. In stillness, you reclaimed authorship over your time, energy, and intent. People sensed the shift because their old access stopped working. The buttons they once pressed no longer produced reactions. The stories they told no longer reached you. The hooks they set no longer held. That absence of reaction created pressure, because pressure exposes dependency. The more you stayed composed, the more unstable the surrounding dynamics became. You didn't harden, you clarified, you didn't disappear, you became selective. You didn't become louder, you became precise. Whatever that move was, it wasn't dramatic, and that's why it worked. It didn't draw attention, but it altered gravity. Conversations changed, expectations adjusted, behavior around you recalibrated itself without instruction. That's how real authority establishes itself, not through force, but through non-negotiable boundaries enforced by consistency. You didn't ask to be taken seriously. You made yourself impossible to manage. And in doing so, you became something far more dangerous to those who relied on your compliance. You became ungovernable. Point 5. Why you no longer feel at home in most spaces. You may notice now that environments you once tolerated feel heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself has changed density. Conversations that once passed the time now feel repetitive, looping in familiar patterns that your mind already finished mapping long before the words are spoken. Social settings feel draining, not because you dislike people, but because you can feel the cost of being present where depth is absent. This is not arrogance, and it is not superiority. It is a mismatch. Your internal pacing has changed. You move differently now, mentally, emotionally, and perceptually. You process deeper, slower, with more discernment. Where others skim the surface, you instinctively scan beneath it. Where others react, you observe. Where others seek stimulation, you seek coherence. You are no longer entertained by surface-level exchange because your mind has shifted into pattern recognition. You hear what is not said. You notice repetitions in behavior, motivations, and emotional loops. Once this switch flips, small talk feels like noise, not connection. This creates isolation, but not because something is wrong with you. It creates isolation because most people bond through shared distraction rather than shared depth. And distraction requires constant motion, constant input, and constant performance. Depth, on the other hand, requires presence. It requires stillness, listening, and the willingness to sit with what is real rather than what is entertaining. You are no longer available for constant emotional labor. You no longer instinctively regulate the room, smooth the tension, or carry unspoken weight for others just to keep things comfortable. You are no longer performing relatability to be accepted. That is not emotional coldness. That is self-containment. Your energy is no longer leaking outward to maintain access, approval, or belonging. It is held, grounded, integrated. This is what happens when your nervous system stabilizes and your identity consolidates. Authority begins internally long before it ever shows up externally. Before recognition, before status, before visible power, there is this phase: quiet separation, reduced tolerance for incoherence, and an unwillingness to fragment yourself to fit unstable environments. This is what authority feels like before it looks like anything impressive from the outside. It is subtle. It is lonely. It is unmistakably calm. And once you recognize it, you stop trying to explain yourself to those who can't feel the shift, because you understand that alignment doesn't argue. It simply stands. Point 6. Why the attacks, projections, and resistance quieted down. At first, there was resistance. You felt the pull to explain yourself, to defend your intentions, and to correct the version of you being spoken about in rooms you were never in. Resistance is natural. It is the nervous system's first response when it senses threat or injustice. But resistance still feeds the system. It confirms engagement. It signals availability. And those who operate through control, provocation, and influence depend on that signal to remain active. They are not sustained by truth. They are sustained by reaction. Then came observation. You began to notice patterns instead of insults, timing instead of tone, motives instead of words. You saw that every accusation required your attention to survive, that every distortion needed your emotional energy to stay alive. You realized this was never about misunderstanding. It was about access, about keeping you psychologically reachable. Once you saw that, something shifted. You stopped reacting automatically. You started watching quietly. And observation is dangerous to any system built on manipulation because it removes urgency and replaces it with clarity. Then came silence, not passive silence, not avoidance, strategic silence. You didn't fight back. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't correct the narrative. You didn't try to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You simply removed emotional access. And that is the most destabilizing move possible to those who rely on influence. Silence starves manipulation. Without reaction, their tactics lose oxygen. Without access, control dissolves. Distance doesn't escalate conflict, it collapses it. This is why things went quiet. Not because you lost, not because they won, but because you became unreachable. The system could no longer extract energy from you. There was nothing left to provoke, nothing left to pull on, and nothing left to distort. When someone cannot affect you, they cannot control the narrative around you. And when control disappears, interest fades. The absence of drama is not stagnation, it is resolution. It is the moment when chaos realizes it has no audience. Stillness is not weakness. It is finality. You didn't retreat. You transcended the battlefield entirely, and in doing so, you forced an ending without ever raising your voice. Point 7. What this phase is preparing you for. This is not the season of visibility. It is the season of internal consolidation, where the noise fades and the mirrors are turned inward, where you are stripped of distraction so that what remains can be examined strengthened, and stabilized. You are learning to hold power without broadcasting it, to sit with capability without announcing it, and to carry authority in your nervous system rather than in your voice. This is the phase where strength is no longer performative. It becomes structural. You are being trained to be grounded without applause, to remain steady when no one is clapping, when no one is affirming, when the external world offers no reflection of your internal growth. That is not neglect. That is precision. Because real power does not depend on reaction. It functions even in silence. You are also learning to be certain without validation, to trust your own alignment when no one confirms it, and to move from inner knowing instead of outer permission. That certainty is quiet, but it is unshakable. When the next phase opens, you will not enter it seeking approval, scanning faces, or adjusting your posture to be accepted. You will enter it already anchored, already settled in who you are, and already immune to being pulled off center by opinion or resistance. That is why this phase feels long, heavy, and sometimes endless, because it is not a temporary adjustment. It is a permanent recalibration. You are not being trained to return to who you were, to recycle old versions of yourself, or to regain former comforts. You are being prepared to move forward without needing to look back, without nostalgia, without dependence on old identities or familiar reactions. Whatever that move was, the decision you made in silence, the boundary you held, the line you refused to cross, it internally crowned you. It shifted something irreversible inside you. And internal crowns do not need witnesses. They do not need recognition, applause, or ceremony. They only need stability. They require a nervous system that can hold power without leaking it through explanation, defense, or overexposure. And that is what this loneliness built. It fortified you. It taught you containment. It taught you how to sit with depth, with weight, with presence. When you step forward again, it will not be louder. It will be heavier. And the world will feel it, even if you never explain a word.